Well, welcome back, everyone. Got an exciting topic today with an exciting guest. So we've been talking a little bit with regards to health span and longevity. We've touched on this importance of muscle mass, which we're learning more and more is extremely important. So now
I'm excited too because I can actually touch someone that's sitting here with us.
I know, we've had so many online guests.
He's right next to me. I can actually
all the way from the US to be with us.
Because it's really tough to come down to Australia. I mean, come on.
Yeah.
Who says no to you guys?
So that, yes, you can be touched by Trev.
touched on and touched by.
But it is genuinely exciting to have you here because this is a topic that I don't know enough about, but I'm interested enough that I know that we can have a really good conversation. So just to give a bit of a background, you've got a long bio, so I was going to shrink that down.
Please.
So Shawn Baier.
Yes.
And you've got a Master of Science and a Master of Business. You're VP of Business Development and is it VP of Business Development MTI Biotech?
It's actually Metabolic Technologies, which is part of TSI Group.
Okay.
Yep.
And within there, and also looking at your history, you've also got a strong focus and a strong interest in muscle mass and why that's important.
Correct.
And how we can maintain that and why that's important to maintain
He's
that
an
over life.
ex-athlete, so the muscle mass thing is going to be in there for
So
sure.
you did say you're an ex-athlete. What sports were you in?
Track and field, and then after I was done with that, I kind of moved into that fringe sport of strongman.
Oh, wow,
Yeah.
okay.
So hang on, so track and field is like, that's pretty generic, like what were you doing?
Because
Were you-
most people don't guess I was a distance runner.
Distance
I'm
runner.
joking. I'm joking. I was a thrower. So
That's right,
shot
yeah.
put, discus, hammer.
Okay, which was your best of those?
I would probably have to say discus.
Discus,
Yeah.
how far did you get it?
He's an ex-athlete.
So I would say probably my best was around the 50-52.
Okay,
Yeah.
and is that
Meter.
meters?
Yeah,
Yeah, that's a long way.
That is
There
a
you
long
go.
way.
So that leads into the strongman, just throwing things.
No, that was the
and-
weird part because I was doing powerlifting and somebody said, "Hey, you were a former thrower. You should try Highland Games," and that was just amazing.
It's like a Scottish
How
thing,
long
isn't
ago are we
it?
talking? Is that
Yeah.
like 2 decades ago or so?
Oh, yeah.
Because that was Highland Games was huge when it first came
Yeah.
on, wasn't it? We're all like
it was
intrigued by it.
great. And then
Yeah.
a few of those gentlemen were into strongman. They said, "You
Yes.
should try this. You're a
Strongman,
strong
yeah.
guy."
Yeah.
So then I tried that.
So
fell in
they're
love with it.
tossing logs and
Carrying
putting
stones
big,
and doing all that
Pulling the
stuff.
trucks.
Yeah, all that. Yeah.
Fantastic.
So it was always part of my life to be around resistance training and athletics. And my wife was a swimmer, so it's kind of ingrained in our family.
Yeah. So I imagine that fed into your interest in muscle.
That's exactly what
yeah.
it was. So I thought I wanted to be a strength and conditioning coach, when I was in university. And then I kind of moved into, I really like this concept of finding out why we have adaptation and why do we make changes. And then when I was in grad school, kind of touching on the subject today, I started doing some research in the area of the biochemical and histochemical changes that occur in muscle as we age.
As we age, right.
Yeah.
Okay.
And then it just brought me into some other research in the nutritional field, protein metabolism, as well as exercise physiology.
Did you say biochemical and histochemical?
Yeah, so like
Histology,
how the actual fibers change and the
Yes.
biochemical changes that happen with age, because we know that the perfect example is when we resistance train. You see hypertrophy. That would be more of the histochemical or the cellular side of things.
Yep.
But then we have the other kind of element of the equation is kind of mitochondrial density, mitochondrial efficiencies, and we start looking at the biochemical changes.
Okay, well, we'll
So
get into
histology, we're usually looking down a microscope, looking at, like you'd be looking at the muscle fibers. So you kind of
Cross-sectional
like the
views.
physical
Tissue.
stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Whereas the biochemical, we might be talking about a protein or an enzyme or a marker or so. Histology more about the tissue
Exactly
side
right.
of things.
Yeah,
Yes.
we look at fiber typing, the C, like type 1, type 2,
Yep.
muscle
AB.
fibers. Yeah.
And you kind of put them on a cross section and you
Learning
cut them.
all
Yeah.
the time.
We will get
Yeah.
into that. But look, I think when most people think about muscle and muscle mass, it really, sort of most people in their minds, it relates either to aesthetics, I want to just maintain my muscle mass, or it relates to performance.
That's me
sports
doing
performance.
aesthetics. That's what aesthetics is.
But the
Woo.
reality is that muscle and maintaining muscle mass has a much wider health benefit, and it's
sure.
important for overall health. Why is that?
That's a great question, first of all. So when we start looking at muscle, we have to look at it as more than just that mobility or, like you just said, the aesthetics, the body shape, that kind of thing. Muscle is this, it's a storage of protein, but it's such an important metabolic, think of it as like a metabolic engine. And when we start seeing atrophy or loss. We have terms like sarcopenia, cachexia, all these different terms, all kind of pointing at this gradual muscle loss that occurs, whether it be cachexia, say in cancer patients, or we start talking about atrophy. We've all seen people who unfortunately maybe broke a leg. We were talking about skiing earlier. They break a leg, they get it casted, and that cast is removed, and you look at that muscle, and it's just a skinny little...
Pretty quickly. It can happen in a few weeks. Yeah.
It does. It does. And some of the bed rest data we see, in as little as 10 days, you can lose 2 kilos. Well, it takes you about 8 weeks to get that back.
Right.
So there's a fragility.
And if you're older, it could take a lot longer. And if you're not doing the physical exercise, so you say that, but people would need to be doing the right things and
That's
to
correct.
actually get enough protein and then obviously be exercising. Yeah.
Right. So there's a fragility to muscle. But going back to the question, once we understand there's this kind of continual stressor to, I'd say, lose muscle as we age, the issue is there's a direct correlation between muscle strength, or let's say muscle health, and kind of predicting cardiovascular death and all causes of death. So we see a high correlation between our muscle health or our systemic muscle strength. We can do something as simple as a hand grip test.
Yes.
And when we see hand grip decrease, you can pretty much, you can predict quality of life versus longevity.
Okay.
And that's where things get really interesting, is once you get to a certain level, there's a disability threshold. And when we talk about muscle and we talk about disability threshold, we start thinking about, oh, you just can't get up out of a chair, or maybe your mobility is limited. No, we're talking about compromising our ability, like survival ability.
Yeah.
Something as simple as the common cold. If somebody is really, I'm thinking older adult here, if they're, say, going back to bed rest, if they're bedridden for a few days, few weeks, they can lose a significant amount of muscle. But the really concerning part is this is where we start getting secondary infections that can come in. When you look at things like the ability to produce a productive cough, clearing the lungs, that takes force.
This is a physical effect that you're looking at.
It does.
Physically, you've lost muscle mass in your diaphragm.
Yep.
So you're actually losing the inability to cough.
This is huge, though, because this is a redefinition of why we see muscle mass as important, or muscle strength.
It is.
Because it's exactly the question you've asked, which I imagine so many people, muscle strength, athletes or recreational, whatever it is, as opposed to my actual longevity, my health span, my wellness, my life force, my continued health. That's huge.
And I just think about how many, older women in particular, falling and breaking hips. We talk a lot about osteoporosis, but if you've got that balance and stability and muscle strength, you're not going to fall over. And I'm really happy you mentioned before about grip strength. We did a podcast our last time talking about testing biological age, and I got excited and talked about epigenetics and things that I do, but there are actual tests like just doing grip strength or standing on one leg and balance that are very strongly linked with aging and sort of so-called biological age, risk of age-related disease.
And look, you say that, and I can understand how that relates to physical function, even diaphragmatic, and you can't cough. But there seems to be, there was a correlation that you made, and I don't quite understand the connection between, you mentioned the immune system. So your increased risk of infection. Is there a correlation between muscle mass and other types of biochemistry in the body?
So the short answer would be sure, there is. But what I'm referring to there is more of when you're not able to produce a productive cough, that's where that secondary infection can come in, because you're not clearing the lung. Now, talking about the immune health relative to losing muscle mass, you can really look at it as it's a stressor on the body as we lose muscle mass. So everything from the risks we are kind of going with here are things like falls with hip fractures. That in itself requires a healing process, and that's a drain on the system. And when we already have lost a lot of muscle, and then you're limiting mobility and they're restricted to maybe 10, 20 days of bed rest, all of a sudden you're talking about scenarios where it becomes very catabolic or muscle breakdown.
So it can be the straw that breaks the camel's back.
Yeah. And we're talking about muscle health. One thing to really think about is perception of muscle health. Kind of going back to the way you asked that question, most people think of muscles, if you ask anybody, from a 5-year-old kid to a 70-year-old person, what do you know about muscles? What do they do? they raise up their arm and they flex their bicep.
Yeah.
It's like, wait a minute, okay. But how do we perceive when something's going wrong with muscle? And what's so interesting, we learned this during one of our studies. It was a year-long study funded by the National Institute of Health and National Institute of Aging in the U.S. And when we were doing this study, we heard from subjects following this study that they said, I just feel like I have more energy, which was kind of perplexing to us because we're like, this isn't an energy product. What are they talking about?
Yes.
But then we did the smart thing. Well, what do you mean? That's what we asked as a follow-up question. They said, well, when I play with my grandkids, I feel like I just have so much more energy. When I go up a flight of stairs, I have so much more energy, or carrying my groceries or going for a walk. I can just go so much farther. It wasn't energy, it was strength. But we just don't know how to vocalize it. And what's one of the number one complaints when people go to their physician over the age of 50? Loss of energy.
Yeah.
Because we don't know how to vocalize, I feel like I'm not as strong as I used to be. Because we don't perceive that as strength. We perceive it as energy because it's the ease of doing things. That comes from our muscle.
But I still question if it is more. And it's just me thinking about, well, what are muscles and what do they do? Well, we were talking about this just a little bit earlier. Muscles are made up not just of muscle fibers, but mitochondria, little energy functions.
Make
in
more
there.
ATP.
So in my mind anyway, I would imagine the more mitochondria you have, the more efficient you are at metabolizing. The more you are able to actually produce energy. Am I right in thinking that?
Well, I mean, it has a metabolic cost too. So the more muscle you have, the more energy you burn. But that's also the beauty of muscle in terms of body composition.
And metabolic rate.
Exactly. Because we're seeing that right now as, the trends are really pushing towards these GLP-1 RA, drugs that are out there.
Yeah.
People are using them.
So for the layman layout there, Ozempic, so GLP-1A, Ozempic. So and Ozempic is a fat loss product. Weight loss or weight control product.
Yeah.
And this is coming with high risks too, right?
You will go through sarcopenia. You will lose your muscles, not just fat. You're losing everything.
Yeah.
And you mentioned before
and
about
a lot of people are on this, right?
Yes.
This has been
numbers are
because the numbers of how much weight you lost is incredible. So people wanting the quick fix are being led down this path, and it's going to be one of those big things that's going to come out.
They could likely have a rebound later on. You can't stay on these things forever. Right. And then they're not going to have the muscle, so they're going to have a lower metabolic rate.
They put on more weight, so back to their old eating habits.
And you're not able to actually sustain the amount of carbohydrates or sugar, because you mentioned about muscle being our source of protein too. So it's a way you can store amino acids if you need them. But also that glucose is being pulled into the muscle for glycogen. You no longer have that glucose being pulled into muscle. So you're getting high blood sugar, metabolic issues, at risk of type 2
insulin
diabetes.
Resistance,
So talking about the importance of muscle, way more than just this when we're just thinking about metabolic health, regulating blood sugars, all of these things.
So some of the side effects that are commonly mentioned with regards to Ozempic, is that at least one of the causes for those side effects?
Well, if you're talking about the GI issues, that's not really from the muscle loss side. Muscle loss is kind of the victim of this process. So
But as a result of that muscle loss, you would have symptoms, I would think.
Yeah. So one thing that's happening, and we all know this about weight loss in general. People are trying to go on a caloric restriction. The goal is normally fat loss, right? But when we start looking at what really happens, you have a very significant amount of muscle loss initially. We always used to say it could be between 40 and 50% of the weight that is lost could be muscle, and more than likely is muscle. And then the other portion of that would be fat. And then as you adapt, your body will start to lose those or use those fat stores.
Yeah.
The issue is with some of these drugs we're seeing, and it's not necessarily because of the drug itself, it's more the simple fact they're not eating.
They're not eating because they're not hungry anymore.
So starvation will be very catabolic. It breaks down tons of muscle for gluconeogenesis, for that carbon backbone of the amino acids. And when it does this, the amount of loss they're seeing, I've heard reports as high as 65% of the weight that's lost is muscle. Now, and that's the initial phase. And then your body will adapt, and it starts to slowly reduce that rate of muscle loss and increase the amount of fat loss. But the problem is you've already lost it. Yeah. And then when you go back,
how long it takes you to get it back.
Yeah, and that's what we talk about all the time.
If people get it back, depending on the lifestyle they lead.
There's a really good study looking at bed rest. 10 days you lose 2 kilos, right? That's been shown a couple different times, but it can be even more than that. And we're using a very extreme example of inactivity. 8 weeks of rehabilitation to get back to where they were when they started. So 10 days to lose, 8 weeks to return back to normal. Wow. That's the fragility of muscle. Yeah. And it's very challenging, especially if you're under 35 and you're very active and something happens where you're bedridden for 3 or 4 days, or you just have a decrease in activity, you'll bounce back pretty good. But when we start getting into our 40s, 50s, 60s and further, when you have that period of inactivity or that amount of muscle loss that occurs because of some situation, getting that back is really not as easy as people might assume it is.
No,
it's actually
I'm
quite
learning
hard.
that. I'm learning that.
And that's the scary part, because I look at my parents and their situation. I know my dad has to have a hip replacement surgery soon. And I keep telling him, you have to prepare for this. He's a very in shape gentleman. He takes care of himself, works out, but there's going to be a large period of inactivity. Yeah. And he thinks, well, once I heal up, I'll go right back to exercising. But you're going to lose a lot. You have to make sure you're trying to get back as soon as possible and recover.
All right. So then we've talked about the importance of muscle. Then what are some of the key factors that we need to consider when it comes to growing muscle and maintaining muscle, particularly as we age?
Sure. So one of the biggest things that you have to think about is, I've mentioned that time frame. So between the ages of 28 to probably 38, we look at that as that kind of peak of where our muscle mass will likely land. Now, if you've always been sedentary and you start exercising in your 50s, yes, you can put on much more muscle than you had if you've always lived a sedentary life. But making the assumption of all things equal, you maintain the same activity level, relatively the same nutrition, you'll reach your peak between that 28 to 38. Reality, we kind of hit that peak around 35 on average. Right. Now, why am I saying that? Because when we set that peak, everything after that, there's an inevitable loss of muscle mass. And the literature shows between 8 and 15% per decade. 8% is on the good side. That's the lower rate of loss, but it's still loss. You think about the concerns people have with bone density. Women, it's a primary driver in the world of nutrition, of making sure we do the right things to maintain bone density. And we look at things like joint health and look at these categories of nutrition where people are targeting products for these specific conditions. But muscle is such like this major event that we're going to have, and we're all going to experience it, is a gradual muscle loss. 100% of the population is going to experience this, but so few people are actively trying to pursue means to minimize it. So again, if it's where we set it and the rate of loss that we'll experience are what we have to be cognizant of.
Okay. So, what are some of those ways? Weight-bearing exercise, I imagine, would be one of those important ways. Do we need to be focused on a specific type of weight-bearing exercise? Yeah,
and I just want to say I'm so glad that you're really highlighting that this needs to be discussed a lot more in the younger years, because we do hear a little bit more about osteoporosis, osteopenia for women, and maybe I say that because I work with more women than men, but it's obviously more of a concern, particularly going through menopause and estrogen, which also affects muscle. So we hear about this osteoporosis, but the reality is sarcopenia also happens at that same time we're getting that bone loss post 35, and women tend to go through muscle loss even faster than men in those perimenopausal years, and you just don't hear this talked about, where you should be talking to women in their 40s, if not earlier, 30s. You really need to start doing strength training.
Is that the young years? When you said the young years, what are we talking, 30s and 40s?
I'm talking 30s and 40s.
Okay.
So rather than in Australia, where through Medicare you can go and get a bone density scan at 70,
right?
After 70, it's covered by Medicare. It's like, and then after 50, they say, well, that's when you're at risk after 50 because you've generally gone through menopause. But hang on, let's start talking about now 30s and 40s, so that then you're not playing catch up in your 50s, or it's just too late. And it's not just the bone loss, it's the muscle loss. And I would think of muscle as the longevity organ, like that is the
100%
that's
agree.
the tissue, that's the organ that we want to focus on to have that healthy aging.
We always look at that cognitive side, but just as important is body, because longevity, everything we're doing to kind of stretch this out to have more years. I just noticed on one of the Australian news programs, they were talking about this program they're going to put out. It's living to 150 and living beyond.
Yes. And that was on the Channel 9 show.
Were they saying living to 150 and beyond? I must have missed that at the start.
It's ambitious.
So I point that out because we do so many things to think about the cognitive side of aging. And if we can look at muscle as equally important and be proactive in it, then you have the quality of life. Because, you know, the old saying, who wants to live forever? But I would sign up for it as long as I had my mental function and physical function, because who doesn't want to do all these life experiences? But if any one of those is lost, you're trapped. You either have a physical body that, you know, can perform and can't, or you have a mental capacity that's there but doesn't have the physical body to perform.
But they're also not happening in isolation. They're not separate. So if we're out there exercising and regularly using that physical body, what are we doing? We're also challenging ourselves neurologically.
Increasing
new
blood
neural
flow
pathways,
as well.
blood flow. We're in nature, perhaps doing exercise, or maybe we're going for a surf, something I like to do. So then there's this cascade
all
of
those
effects,
hormones, BDNF.
cascade of effects into the neurological.
I'm thinking BDNF, and
Which
that's
makes you then think, I'm going to go do it again, which is a cascade of effects back into the physical. It's not like we're one being. This is one big incredible organism that actually is like an orchestra. That, bring the horn section in now.
Into your question then. So what can you do? So obviously it's the physical. So it's just like anything else. Once you start forming that habit, we don't want exercise to be the mundane and like, oh, I have to go do this. Yes, there's always going to be that challenge of getting, like you said, there's that element of resistance or load, weight bearing that we have to do. And there's always going to be that challenge if that has a feeling of work, right? But that is so important, because as you start to do it, as you find activities that you enjoy, and that becomes less about work, more about taking the enjoyment out of that lifestyle and that active lifestyle, whether it's surfing, kayaking, resistance training.
So these are
Walking
all
the stairs.
what you would call weight-bearing exercises?
I would say there's any activity that has a dynamic component. Now, we say that, but then in the same breath, we have to think of the population, because as you know, when you're younger, and I'm still considering younger, 30s, 40s, 50s, because we're younger, we can do these activities. As we get older, there's more need to have some structure and some balance element added to it, so we're not risking any type of injury. But at the same time, all these different activities, most importantly, is some form of structured resistance training. And then obviously we want to do things that get the heart rate up. We want some cardiovascular benefit there too. But then if you can intertwine that and make it enjoyable by doing activities that you like to do, that creates this physical, right? The stimulus or the requirement for adaptation to keep muscle mass. But then there's the nutritional intervention. You know, we always point to protein. Well, protein's great. Protein delivers the building blocks. But we have to make sure, as we age especially, that we're turning on that muscle machinery. We want protein synthesis elevated, protein degradation decreased. And that's kind of the equation that happens within our muscle.
Well, we want to talk about protein,
right.
but I am interested also in those other elements. So are you saying there are certain nutrients that we need to focus on that help to prevent that protein degradation, or is that more about just maintaining that exercise?
There's a reason why I'm here is to talk about an ingredient I know fairly well.
No, let's leave that for later. That's the ingredient.
That's the one I would probably bring up. Yes.
So you're talking about doing things you enjoy, and I think that's so important. And I'm really happy you said about the holistic thing too, because when I said muscle being the longevity organ, I think it's more if you can be focusing on, maintaining or even building that muscle, of course you are also then, the BDNF, brain-derived neurotropic factor, gets lit up in exercise. It helps with the brain and neurotransmitters. But I've noticed something because, I'm interested in healthy aging as well. When my daughter goes from one end to the other end of the house, it's rare that she would walk. She skips, she jumps, she hops, like on one leg. So she's 7, my youngest. She will hop. She'll be like, Mum, I'm not going to touch any of the lines. She hops with one leg, and then you look at how we change.
Why don't we do that?
Exactly. When I go to the kitchen, I'm not hopping on one leg so we don't move as much. And I say this because I have a lot of women that come to me too and say, I've gone through menopause, that's it. I can't lose weight. I can't do this. And it's like, well, actually, let's have a look at the lifestyle you're leading. Are you moving? What is your diet? How are you sleeping? And I think, as you said, the exercise can be enjoyment. It could be playing with your kids. It could be just doing something else that isn't so-called exercise. You're just actually using your body.
Well, I think you are probably the person that would be a good example of
hopping to the kitchen.
Well, no, those activities, doing those, because when you answered your question about what would you do with an extra 10 years of life, it was all physical activities with your grandkids. You would want to go out surfing with your grandkids, out paddling with your grandkids. That represents to me, it's not just enjoyment, but there's an element of love love there too. So
this is my little segue too, because a model I think that we accept more in Western society now is body, mind, and soul. So body, mind. We've talked about body, mind. So what's the soul aspect? But when you get body, mind right, because the word enjoyment, what's right in the middle? Joy.
Yeah.
And joy is not happiness. Happy is like, it's similar.
Yeah.
But
Happy's
I'm
fleeting.
happy with this situation.
Yeah.
I'm really happy. I just got a pay raise. I'm really happy. I
But
just
it's
lost
fleeting.
that weight.
Yeah.
Joy is like something coming up through us and exuding.
Right.
Like enthusiasm is Latin for the God within, and inspiration is Latin for spirit within. Is joy is literally this feeling of like my spirit.
Yeah.
For want of a better word, because these
it's
words
true.
are so misconstrued. But while you're talking about, I get a sense of that. I'm like, this is probably our biggest problem. Why are we not skipping down the hallway?
Yeah.
Because we're not in joy.
Yeah.
So there's no enjoyment because we're not in joy. And I think about, I was working with a group one time and they were talking about, what gives you joy? And this guy was in a football club and he was talking about when I come home and I walk in the door and my dog looks at me, his tail starts wagging. And he says,
joy.
he's so happy to see me. But, not everybody else is happy to see me, And I'm like, your husband or your wife or your kids or whatever it is. Imagine if you walked in, their tail started wagging. Oh my God, because it can't physically contain it. That to me is the body, mind, but then something comes out and there's a visceral, physical, something we can see, but something was just animated through us.
Yeah.
And I think that's the deeper purpose of why we're doing all this is because, sure, it's great to live longer, but with great purpose and life force and to share and to, all these sort of things.
Well, that's coming back to your point. I mean, we all want to live to 150, but if we don't experience that, yes, we want to maintain our cognitive abilities and our physical abilities, but even then, that's probably not enough. We want to have a
You don't
purpose.
have that joy.
Yeah.
Yes. I'm looking at a property at the moment, changing houses and looking at a property. And as I walk out of the property, my wife goes, what do you think? And I go, I think it's the one. She says, why? And I go, because it's got a waterfall on it and a mandarin tree. So why did I say those two things is because I can just pick, it's readily available. Something's available to me like abundance.
Yeah.
So I'm craving abundance.
Yeah.
And a waterfall, I can look at it and I can actually go, there's this, when I'm big
Relaxing.
on water,
Yeah.
it's relaxing.
Yeah.
And so it's like, what about the bedrooms and the lounge room and the storage shed and everything else? Oh yeah, that's pretty cool. But that mandarin tree and so later in life, I'm 56 in a couple of months, and that shift happens where you start actually valuing the things that just fill you up.
Yeah.
Right. I agree.
So I just find this fascinating because for the first period of my late 40s, early 50s, when I'm beginning to go through the muscle degradation, if I'm not doing anything about it, what's actually happening at the same time, I'm beginning to wind down. And a lot of people are thinking about their investment portfolio and their superannuation and their caravan on the back of the truck to do a lap of Australia and all these sort of things. But all of those are becoming more sedentary.
Yes.
They're becoming more relaxed. What was I thinking about at 20? I wanted to ride the next biggest swell that came through. And
This is a key point. It really is.
So even the way what we're focusing on, what we're thinking, what we're chasing, what we're pursuing in our life changes. So it's easy for you at that age group mentally and spiritually to begin to go, I've lived a good life. It's all about the kids having a good life now, rather than what's the next waterfall I can climb? What's the next place, next thing I can achieve, the next little neural pathway I can open up because I'm trying a sport or even an art that I've never tried before. So to me that means while I was degrading in muscle, I was also thinking, this is good. This is the stage of life I'm at. And then I went, whoa, hang on. I'm beginning to lose some function that's very natural to my spirit. I'm paddling out in big surf and I'm puffing way more. And I'm like, any other swell, any time in recent history, I could paddle out here and paddle around with the young guys and share waves with them. I'm puffing thinking, I think I need to get a wave in. I'm like, that has to change.
Yes.
And that's when I started investigating and finding out about muscle loss and muscle retention. And you said muscle strength, like muscle health.
Yeah, muscle health is the
Muscle
term I like
health,
to use.
as opposed to
we like
muscle
to use.
mass, which is great. Muscle health is your more
So
defining
did you actually
characteristic.
define what muscle health is, though? Is it?
So, that's a tough question because, when we start talking about the health of something, it's relatively abstract, right?
Yeah.
You can put some parameters around it. For example, a certain amount of muscle mass, but depending on the individual, how can I say my muscle mass should be, or more importantly, all of our muscle mass should be at some level because we have quite different body types.
But does it relate to muscle function? Does it relate to
that's just
how
where I was
much
going with that.
mitochondria we have?
We have muscle mass. The the percentage of muscle mass that we carry. And then we also have the muscle function side. So when we typically talked about function before, we always looked at strength parameters, but there's important elements that are there relative to power, that anaerobic capacity, the aerobic capacity, so the VO2 max, various elements that show not just the muscle mass and the strength, but really their function. And then when we start talking about older adults, one thing we really have to start looking at is real world application. So as I mentioned before, when older adults start talking about energy and say, I lack energy, well, a lot of times that's perceived by activity. So there's tests we do in the lab, but when we're doing studies with older adults to look at how body or muscle health changes, we look at things like hand grip strength, get up and go. That's an interesting test where you set it up where there's a chair at one side of the room. They walk 3 meters, they come back and sit down. And we time them to look at what they can do. Now, we tell them it's a walk, but it's a brisk walk. And this dates us when we say this in our studies, but we say walk as if the phone's ringing on the other side of the room. Well, that's not as applicable these days because we all have our phones on our pocket. But for that generation that we're talking to, they get it and they do this nice brisk walk. But what's interesting is that as we age, that goes from being about 7 seconds to 12 seconds, 15 seconds. If you think about that, that is the perception of, I just don't have energy to get there and get back quick. No, they don't have the strength. They don't have the confidence in their gait. When you start seeing dramatic changes in gait, typically it has a lot to do with balance and that vestibular system, but it has a lot to do with confidence in their strength to take a stride. And when
what did you say, vestibular system?
That's kind of your balance system.
Okay,
Think of that system
I'm just the guy that clarifies everything for everybody.
You weren't sure you had one of those, were you?
Vestibular system. I just lost balance when you said that. What does that even mean? Vestibular system. Okay, cool.
It's in our ears. It kind of keeps us kind of righted. And we all feel it when we ride a roller coaster or we ride one of those amusement park rides and it kind of gets out of whack.
You get that inner ear infection or that weird thing.
Spin around and around.
Okay. Well, look.
So can I just ask quickly, so grip strength, get up and go, and also VO2 max you mentioned.
Yeah, so VO2
max.
But
that's really coming in as a big one, isn't it?
Right. Well, I was making that reference just as various things we can test to look at how we're doing. Because VO2 max, obviously, there's a huge component of the cardiovascular. For the average listener, what is VO2 max? So VO2 max is really the rate or the maximal rate of oxygen consumption by our body during a physical test.
Yep.
And there's a max and there's a peak. So peak means you kind of got to the highest level you could and you had to stop. Yep. Max is where you actually reach a plateau. And what that means is that is the maximum amount of oxygen our body can use at that time to produce energy. Yep. In other words, that's as good as our efficiency is.
So the higher that is, the more efficient we are, the more
you start looking at some of these like triathletes and really those ultra distance runners, they just have a VO2 max through the ceiling. But
and traditionally cross-country skiers were massive, because altitude plus upper body and lower body at the same time.
And a lot of times we look at that as, well, it's not a muscle function, that's a cardiovascular function. And that's true, that has a huge cardiovascular pulmonary element to it. But we still have to have, going back to that mitochondrial density, we have to have this bigger buffer mitochondria, those powerhouses in the muscle cells, to be able to do that. That aerobic capacity comes from the cellular ability to process, bring oxygen in and process that energy, through the Krebs cycle, then electron transport chain, and recycle that ATP efficiently. But then if we start looking at things that can go wrong, if we're just simply inactive, all that machinery, just the same thing you can do to train it, the inverse of those happen when we are sedentary.
Right.
So then we start having these changes. So going back to kind of the things you were talking about, it's so important to keep using it. And yes, we know there's going to be moments when there's an injury or illness, we can't stay active for a short period of time, but getting that back and not breaking that cycle, that positive reinforcement from physical activity. Because here's the biggest thing that we're seeing. We've always known this when we've talked about in the exercise physiology world about that starting an exercise program. We just don't realize how challenging that is to the average person. We all say, go exercise. Our doctors will say, oh, you need more exercise. You need to eat better. It's
incredible. And it's very loose guidelines, no structure.
But even when you say that, though, when they start, the average individual that starts an exercise program that hasn't done one in the past or maybe did one and took significant time off, there's an incredible amount of pain and discomfort. And if we typically experience pain and discomfort, and going back to that joy statement you said before, if you're not getting that positive reinforcement back, it's very challenging to be habitual
put yourself
about
through
it.
that.
Yeah. And why this matters is because we know the same process of how muscle's lost is very gradual. It's the old saying, death by 1,000 cuts, right? When you finally get to the point where it's starting to impact, it's been a long period of time.
Yeah.
Inversely, when we're trying to gain back muscle, it works the same way. It's
Gradual.
It's that kind of adding a layer of clay to that sculpture. It takes time. It takes time over and over again. But that reinforcement doesn't come fast enough sometimes for people. Yeah. So we have to inform people when it comes to exercise that you have to have that exercise and patience as well.
Yeah.
Because it will be there. It is doing good. But it's just the small
Trust
little
the process.
Exactly. Trust the process.
Okay, well, look, that's the physical side of things, and we could talk a lot more about that.
Oh, sure.
But I am also keen in discussing the other aspect, and that is, well, let's start with protein. So why is protein important? And importantly, how much do we actually need? Because this seems to be an area of contention.
It is. It is. And, I wish we could wave a magic wand and make everybody agree, but that's never going to happen about anything. So we have to talk about both sides of the equation or both sides of, I don't want to say the argument.
But it is a bit of an argument. You'll have people that are really like, you've got to be having this much protein, and then you look at the standard guidelines and they're like, you just don't need it. You're like, whoa, what are we focusing on here?
That's why I say it's just, well, just to break it down quickly, it's very challenging for a governing body to give a recommended daily allowance, right? Because we're making the assumption that we're all equal. The problem is that we all have different demands and we all have different sizes. So if we really look at kind of the root of what you asked there, and let's just focus on protein. We want to make sure that people are consuming, and I mean this individually, the right amount of protein for themselves. Now, that's easy to say if you have a background in nutrition or protein metabolism, or just have read up on this subject, and you can make some good self-recommendations. But we have to be able to look at this seriously and say, okay, what's the importance of protein and why am I supposed to eat protein? Because everybody tells us, well, make sure you consume enough protein. Well, what is the reason why, and what is enough? So let's just break that down really quick. So first and foremost, protein delivers amino acids, which are building blocks. It is a macronutrient, but the key part here is I like to, when I used to teach, I used to use these kind of analogies to things that make it easier to understand.
Great.
And
I'm always asking for these.
Yeah. So the one I use, and people are probably rolling their eyes that know me that are watching or listening to this, is I like to look at protein as our body, our muscle in our body, as like this house that needs remodeled. You just talked about real estate, right? And so if you buy that house and you want to remodel it, think of protein as the building blocks, or in other words, the boards, the bricks, the mortar, all that showing up at your house, right? So we have to take that and tear some stuff down, put up new stuff. So it's in the yard,
you've had it stacked over the side?
So we bring that in, and we bring it in piece by piece, and we kind of put stuff together. We tear apart the old stuff, and we put that together. That's happening every day, about 1 to 2% of our muscle proteins being turned over. And if you look at that calculation and then you say, okay, well then you need roughly about this many grams of protein per day. That's kind of short-sighted because there's so much more going on. So, again, I think we're typically look at 60 to 80 grams is what's recommended, or 0.8
per kilo of body weight.
No, well, that's 0.8 grams.
No, that's like total. He's saying total.
Okay. Yeah, so 0.8.
That's the recommendation.
So that's the recommendation. So 0.8 grams per kilogram of body weight, or 60 to 80 grams is what some people will say. The reality is, I think even in a normal, healthy adult, and I say normal, I'm trying to imply that there's no disease condition.
Yeah, so they're moving around, they're going to work, they drive their car.
I think 1 gram is probably the right number on a general average. Right. But if we're talking somebody
so in other
who's
words,
young,
if you're 80 kilos, that's 80 grams of protein throughout the day.
I think that's
the I want to emphasize,
that is the absolute minimum.
Good, we're on the same track.
The absolute minimum.
Yeah.
Now, we are talking about people that are more active, athletes.
Or people that want to gain some muscle.
Exactly. You have to be cognizant of the fact that you want to bump that number up. Athletes, I think, I've seen for bodybuilders, you see as high as 2 to 3 grams per kilogram of body weight. Now, am I saying that is going to be well utilized, 100% of that? No, that's additional calories. You can start looking at that side of the equation. Of whatever you overconsume and you don't utilize, it's excess calories. So you can see where there's a balance here. So kind of touching on that, the main thing we have to keep in mind is, what will our body utilize? In other words, going back to the statement of, if you're trying to gain muscle, Yes, just consuming more protein is an element of increasing protein synthesis, because if the substrates or those building blocks are there,
Yep.
you'll put on some more muscle. You'll turn on protein synthesis. But there has to be a little bit of a limit there, and unfortunately there is. But we have to make sure that muscle machinery is turned on, and the other part of it isn't breaking down at a faster rate. Unfortunately, as we age, there's a couple things playing against us. One of those is our ability to absorb proteins as easily as that we once could, and that decreases with age.
So what's behind that? Why don't we absorb protein as we age?
There's a whole host of issues probably going on, but it's really just the efficiencies of the system start to change. Where we
starting with digestion, our ability.
I would say all the way from
yeah.
digestion to the transport of well, first of all, with the peptides or dipeptides and tripeptides, those peptides you cross over, they're much easier absorbed than free amino acids. First of all. But when we start looking at some of those efficiencies, they change. And then utilization.
The pH in the gut changes, absorption of minerals and iron, B12 deficiency becomes more common as we age.
And then utilization, in other words, kind of turning those broken down pieces of protein, those amino acids, into new proteins in the body are limited. And why is that? Because we see actually a decrease in protein synthesis with age, and we see an increase in protein degradation or the breakdown. So we got to start looking at ways we can kind of shift that.
That as we age, we potentially need more protein than when we were younger, just to I suppose to account for the fact that we're not utilizing it as well.
So just throwing more protein at the problem isn't necessarily the solution.
Right.
Once you meet the demand of what your machinery is turned on for, that increased protein or that rate of protein synthesis and that rate of degradation, if you're kind of in a state where synthesis isn't as high as degradation, it doesn't matter how much protein you're delivering, you're in a net kind of building, net loss. So you can still be consuming the right amounts of protein, but you just aren't turning that machinery on the right direction.
So what are the simple primary things we need to do to make sure that machinery is turned on?
Into the
So first and foremost, activity. Make sure that muscle machinery is turned on, because as we know, I'm referring to it as exercise, but it's any activity is going to have a stimulus for protein synthesis. When a muscle's yield saying if you use it or if you don't use it, you'll lose it. Well, it's inverse too. If you use it, your body will adapt and you'll keep adding more muscle.
Can I share something quickly? Because I started to go back into the gym. And as I went back in the gym, I was doing these workouts and certain things, and I was trying things like high intensity interval training, things like that. Just measuring different things. But all of a sudden I made one change. I heard about TUT, time under tension.
Yes.
So basically using a bench press as an example, or a chin up. A bench press would be a push up, relatively fast and explosive, and then you take 5 seconds to bring all the way back down. And then to accumulate 45 seconds worth of movement, time under tension throughout one rep range.
What's the benefit of that?
So what I found was, what was sort of sold to me as I listened and recorded it, is that it creates a demand inside the body. So as your time under tension, the body, because I love that saying, where the mind goes, the body will follow. And where all of a sudden we realize I have to actually hold this for longer, the body goes, well, what do I need to do to be prepared? If he's going to keep doing this, if he's going to come back and do this again tomorrow, what do I have to do to maximize his ability to do this thing? He seems to be interested in it. And if I was enthusiastic about it, there's that God within again, doing this thing, going, wow, I can feel this benefit. So now I'm engaged in the process, but my body's going, right, well, he seems to be enjoying it. He seems to have done it 3 or 4 times this week. So we're going to get prepared for him to do it again. I put more muscle back on in a short period than I had for years. Just for that one change. I could feel the difference, and then in my energy, as in I couldn't explain what it was. I feel better energy. It was endurance, it was stamina, it was strength, everything too. All of a sudden...
Well, you're sort of under resistance for a lot longer than just doing
that, isn't it?
Under
tension.
So the physiology of it is, so we always look at like the concentric or the pushing, right? Or the contraction of the muscle part, where the muscle's shortening. We look at that as, well, that's the part where it's working.
Yeah.
Well, some of the most damaging, taxing resistance training you can do is what we're talking about here with the eccentric phase. So that is when we're thinking typically like lowering the weight, or in other words, it's that stretching under tension of the muscle. And why is that? Because those actin and myosin cross bridges, those are the things that kind of make it kind of come together. But when you're making those slowly release, you have these little mistakes that happen. And then all of a sudden
But you're
there's
still kind of holding on at the same time, aren't
Exactly.
you?
You
So
are,
yeah.
and it's
Yeah.
even harder
So
to hold
you
on
have
when
these-
you let
you
it
have
go.
this-
Yeah.
you have this. So one of the best models to create muscle damage, when you do this to see if you can have an effect through nutrition, through some type of intervention, some modality to minimize that muscle damage if you're doing a study. But one of the things we do, one of the best models, is downhill running. And the reason why is we think about downhill running in the quadriceps in the leg. When those muscles, when you strike the ground, you're kind of
Catch
braking.
yourself.
Yep. And that braking, that's that elongating of the muscle or it's the stretching of the muscle while it's trying to still contract.
Right.
And you get more of a stressor there. And the stressor is where we get adaptation from.
More cellular activation, like they're activated.
Yep.
Yeah, and clarifying that the damage actually is a good thing
Yes.
because you're getting the repair.
Well, the stimulus is the good thing. The
Yes.
damage is
Because-
damage. This was the old thing we used to say years ago, right? You really gotta tear it down to rebuild it. The reality is that what really requires that, or what creates that tear down or that damage, is the amount of intensity required to have adaptation. So it's more corollary than it is actually causal. Because in reality, if we can minimize microtrauma with the same amount of intensity, in other words, have a protective effect on that muscle, and then put that load on that muscle, you'll get the adaptation. But the really cool part is you can recover faster.
Right. Okay.
and
So
you
really,
get
what
all
you're
the
doing
muscle
is
soreness.
you're telling the muscle, I am putting my muscles under a greater degree of stress.
Exactly.
I don't have to necessarily tear the muscle.
No.
I just need you to adapt.
Exactly. And that's
Yeah.
where,
Oh,
again,
I learned something. I
I
was still
directly
old school.
experienced
I was
that.
old school. I was
Yeah.
thinking, muscle tears then lead to,
Yeah.
more growth and repair.
that's just
there
corollary.
You go.
Now, I'm not saying you don't need that high enough intensity. I'm just saying that we don't necessarily need the micro trauma.
You can feel it. Like,
well, the
so
delayed
I could
onset
feel
muscle
the
soreness.
difference. I'm like,
Yeah.
whoa,
Yeah.
as opposed to where I would have gone once as a pro athlete. It was like, no, hang on a second. I have to look after myself. And I would do 3 sets, but the first set was warm up. It was very light to go through the movements. Then I'm only doing 2 sets. It's like, oh, that's not enough. Well, it absolutely was enough.
Oh, sure.
And then I started dropping weight. I was plateaued at a point, and I dropped 4 or 5 kilos like that because the metabolism fired back up with that extra muscle growth
Yep.
and even the body preparing itself to do this. I'm doing chin-ups and the body's going, well, we probably need to strip some weight, and it started dumping weight.
How many chin-ups can you do?
At the moment, I'm back up to about 3 sets of 10.
Good for you.
geez.
That's great.
Yeah,
I
and I'm
cannot
about
do
95
chin-ups.
kilos.
I used to
We
be
should
able to
ask
do them.
Craig
I cannot do them
Harper.
anymore.
Yeah.
He's like 60, right? And he's doing them all the time. I see them on his social
that?
media thing. Craig Harper when he was in
right,
here.
yeah.
I think you can do 60 at 60, right?
I think
Wow.
maybe he did tell us he does.
That's
He's
great.
60.
years
Yeah.
old.
Wow.
Craig Harper.
Yeah, I think so. God, I hope
yeah.
Sorry, Craig, if you're not and you're listening to this.
Beautiful human too, by the way. But but I love that because I had direct experience of it as a previously trained athlete into certain ways of going about it. But back then I was the young guy that was trying to beat the world.
Right.
Now I'm an older guy that's like, I just want to enjoy my life and be there for my kids and share some love and all this sort of stuff. And it's like, hang on, I've got to go back in the gym though.
Yeah.
And so when I go back in, I don't want to change it. I just want to actually, what do I need to do? And so
We'll get the most out of your time. You want the old saying, the biggest bang,
30
buck.
minutes,
for your buck.
30-minute
Right.
session,
Yeah.
35 max.
Right. But that goes back to what we're saying here. So if we're looking at what can we do, especially as we age, there's the activity standpoint, and there's all those great elements. And then talking about protein and protein consumption, if we're exercising and we get that training stimulus to increase protein synthesis. But just as important is that, we always talk about nutrition, but it's what do we talk about nutrition? So it's eating the adequate amounts of protein for what my demand is. And then it's also, again, all the micronutrients we need. And I'm sure you guys have discussed that before. But then I'm going to introduce a topic of there's a specific ingredient, and its initialism's HMB. It goes by the brand name MyHMB. And I bring this up because HMB is an initialism for Beta-Hydroxy-Beta-Methylbutyrate.
Initialism. So what? It begins with that or something. It starts.
Well, see,
it leads to
what's
it. What
the
does
correct
this
way
mean?
of saying the acronym is when you create a word like, what's a good example of that?
It's like an acronym.
Yeah, but I'm saying what's a good acronym to use an example? It creates a word where initialism is you're saying the initials.
Okay,
Yes.
gotcha.
Yeah.
All right, sorry.
Yeah.
Okay, right.
Yeah.
So it's very- something very simple.
Yeah.
Not like MTHFR, which is short for mother.
Now, if you weren't here, he would have said the word. It's not because we're on a podcast. It's
I'm
not
not going to show this is, but you can say whatever you want.
We
I'm not here to
laugh, we
keep you in
laugh,
check.
we cry, we swear,
yeah.
just,
But HMB, again, Beta-Hydroxy-Beta-Methylbutyrate, it's a downstream metabolite of leucine, which is one of the amino acids. So when we start talking about the importance of protein, a lot of times we point to animal proteins because of the content of leucine.
Right.
And leucine, when you consume leucine in high enough amounts, we start to see changes in protein synthesis. And that kind of created this whole line of research back in the 1980s, early 1990s, where they were looking at what other metabolic fates, or why is leucine doing this? And what are the metabolic fates of leucine? And there were some, downstream metabolites. One of them was HMB. So HMB, we have to look at it as it comes from amino acid, but it's not an amino acid building block. What's interesting, it's a signaling molecule. And it makes sense that if we consume protein and high amounts of protein, that there'd be something in there, and that magic sauce, if you will, that turns on protein synthesis and reduces protein breakdown. So what's interesting is leucine will, and high amounts of protein will increase protein synthesis when you consume it to a point. What's interesting about HMB is HMB, when you consume it at, between, roughly about 3 grams per day. So it's a significant amount.
Yeah.
But I look at it as if you were to try and get it through your diet, you'd have to consume about 600 grams of leucine-rich protein, or about 60 grams of leucine per day. And that's assuming you can keep that same rate of about 5% of leucine.
So just to contextualize that back to the point where we know that as you get older, your ability to digest and utilize protein is compromised. Not only are you missing out on that protein, but you're also missing out on that downstream product, that HMB, which is the signaling molecule to create more muscle.
Now, if you directly supplement it, that's where you get these additional benefits. And what we see, going back to the
So you're
analogy,
switching it back on, like basically.
Yeah, so the analogy I used before about those building blocks in the house you're buying and you're going to have to do a little remodeling on, right? So now we have these, we bring the protein in, and you can bring a couple extra trucks in now with more building supplies. So you can increase your protein, or when you do increase your protein,
You can make the wall thicker.
You're actually going to utilize
you're actually
it.
going to utilize it. And more importantly, not just the protein synthesis or the building side, but you're going to reduce, in older adults, you'll reduce that rate of protein breakdown. So we're talking about a nutritional intervention here. So I'm using my hands, and I know this is a podcast, so people are listening.
That's right. We're video as well.
When you're elevating protein synthesis and you're reducing degradation, you have to look at the gap you're creating. When we work on one side of the equation, again, going back to another one of these visuals, so think of it as our muscle mass, our muscle health as a bucket of water. And if the hole at the bottom that's draining it, which would be represent protein or protein breakdown, if that's bigger than what you can fill at the top, you're losing.
Yeah.
What HMB does is it helps make that hole a little smaller, reduces that rate of protein breakdown, and it helps with what is coming in. So that you
It makes the hose in bigger.
Yeah.
How does that actually work then? So as a signaling molecule, what does it do? It attaches to a receptor on muscles? Or
So we see improvements in things like mTOR, which is a direct kind of stimulator of tissue building.
Yeah.
And then we see ubiquitin pathways, kind of what is kind of the culprit here for protein breakdown. And we see some changes in that ubiquitin pathway. So you're really working on both sides that truly as a signaling molecule.
So this is very much related to longevity then as well, isn't it?
Very much.
This is exciting.
Yeah.
This is really, really cool because this is a problem, firstly, that we've suffered for eons, but secondly, we didn't know we were suffering from it majorly, that this muscle loss and therefore longevity and lifespan, health span, everything. But when you introduce, and because we're interviewing some amazing people at the moment, and every time I start falling in love with people, I'm like, oh my God, I love Shawn, because you've spent your life exploring this, and this in particular, when you talk about with such passion and enthusiasm. There's the God within again. But what I'm finding is not just you're talking about a building block for the body, but all these people around the world are discovering all these pieces that have been missing from our puzzle for a long time. Yep. And to me, I get excited about this because if you can reduce that hole that the water's draining out of in your bucket, and if you can increase that flow that's going into it, this is massive for people. Yep. This is not just the life force for them, but the impact they have on their kids and their grandkids and the way they carry themselves, their mental attitude. By the way, for me, the way they don't just automatically do what the government tells them to do because they've still got some spunk in their spirit at 60 years of age.
Sure, yeah.
So all of a sudden we start thinking for ourselves and we live longer, and we have this, I'm going off on a slight tangent here, but we have this almost indigenous wisdom where the older people are revered for because their life force is so great still.
Right.
They've got great intelligence they can share.
Wisdom.
That's what I get from this. That's where this cascades for me. People are older, smarter, better, brighter, still active because of this simple thing, muscle retention and even potential muscle rebuilding,
Yep.
reversing the aging process. This is amazing.
I'm interested in knowing, how has this been studied? What are some of the key studies? So I'll get in front of the microphone. What are some of the key studies that support this? And what did it show?
And can I ask, have you done studies in people that have experienced like bed rest or people that, great.
So this opens up a whole can of worms, the old rabbit hole saying here. But a few things I just want to touch on is a little bit deeper on the mechanism of action. Because what's really interesting when you talk about something that turns on a switch somewhere or it turns off another switch, it doesn't make sense if it just does it in a silo, right? So when we start talking about HMB and we're talking about passion here, what really, every time we open up a new door and we see it, it's almost like this intuitive moment where you go, why did we think of this? So one of the interesting things about HMB, when it turns on protein synthesis, reduces degradation, and think of it as like protecting that muscle during all types of stress.
Yeah.
Well, one of the things we talked about, we made the reference to the drug Ozempic. So when individuals are starving, you can maintain muscle, and it's all types of stimulus for protein degradation or protein breakdown in muscle, right? So even during starvation, we can have a protective effect, not just with aging, not just with sarcopenia, not just with resistance training, but
illness and sickness and bedridden. And
even in situations where we have this stimulus for protein breakdown because of starvation, HMB can protect. But what's really cool part, and this is where I get excited, is because we found out later that HMB can actually increase beta oxidation in muscles as well as increase lipolysis in fat cells.
So it's going to help you
for
burn fat as well.
For Trevor's benefit, so beta oxidation.
Thank you.
Burn fat for energy.
Yeah, so beta oxidation is when our muscles have the improved ability to use fatty acids for energy.
Yeah.
You get an efficient mitochondria for energy metabolism for fat cells or for fatty acids. But what's really interesting on the kind of the fat cell or the adipose tissue, we see an increase in lipolysis. And now I should add the caveat, the way you study this is in cell culture work on these two, right? So with the fat cell in cell cultures, when you increase the concentration of HMB in that cell culture media, you see an increase in lipolysis. In muscle cells, when you increase the concentration of HMB, you see an increase in beta oxidation or that burning of fat.
Yeah.
But what's really neat is as the cell is exposed longer days or more days with HMB in that cell culture, that efficiency improves. It goes right back to kind of like...
it does, often when you think I keep on taking a supplement and I'm going to get
inhibition.
used to it,
feedback inhibition,
and it's going to lose its effect.
No,
you don't, in fact, you see an increase in
and we
effect.
can't say it's exponential, like it keeps going.
Awesome.
I'm sure at some point it starts to plateau because you have your efficiencies are coming from probably mitochondrial efficiencies with utilizing fats for beta oxidation, and HMB is just turning on the stimulus.
But even if it plateaus, it doesn't necessarily decline.
No, exactly.
So
you would assume not, right?
So let's go back for a moment for the layperson listening. Lipolysis is?
Think of it as the breaking down of our fats in our fat stores. So we have muscle store, you have storage of proteins that are in muscle in essence, and you have storage of fats that are in adipose tissue or fat cells.
Yes, and that is utilized for fuel as well. Right.
So lysis, that's breaking down, or like Genesis is like making something new. So we're breaking things down and we're building things up.
I'm fully geeking out with you guys here.
So this is
really cool.
what really gets us excited when we talk about things like the use of these class of drugs, the Ozempics that are causing this. One of the things we can do for an intervention is add something like HMB along with protein and micronutrients to make sure the individual that does choose to do this is doing it in a way that is still or can be healthy from a nutritional aspect.
And not
any
being
weight
abused.
loss intervention.
Any weight
really.
loss, not just those drugs. Because this is where a lot of we haven't done the specific studies in this class of drugs or these consumers or patients using that class of drugs.
It's hypothetical, theoretical, but it makes sense. Mechanistically.
We've done studies in, there was a study in these judo athletes that were cutting weight to make a weight class. It's a very intense process. I don't condone it, because if you really want to make a weight class for a competition, you should train for that to be in that weight class so that you're not trying to...
I dated someone for 6 years who used to do this, and actually one of his colleagues, she was a female, she's actually... in the Olympics, Taekwondo actually cut all her hair off as well. Like not only we're doing all the weight stuff and in the sauna and the suits and everything, but like everything.
Well, there's water manipulation. There's all kinds of things.
Dehydrating themselves.
But the goal is to have the most muscle when we compete. Many times when you're cutting weight, you lose muscle and you're maintaining the fat. So it's really not this optimal athlete. But we can kind of put that off to the side.
One quick question again. So you mentioned cell culture studies, just for the person listening. So that means it's not been studied at this level in humans yet. It's been studied on the...
So just on that mechanism of action.
Cell culture study means what?
We're studying it in a cell outside the body.
Yeah.
And that's just one aspect of the research.
But that's a great indicator of what could...
We mimic as close as possible what could be happening. So you're putting them in liquids that mimic, all that...
Gives you a great indication of what would maybe happen in the body.
Very likely.
But then we know that because you take that model, that's how you find the mechanism.
Yep.
And typically what we do in research in the whole body, what you're looking at is secondary outcomes or secondary endpoints that are indicative of what you found in the mechanism. For example, we've done studies in time-restricted feeding or intermittent fasting, where there's a form of caloric control or consumption control. We've done studies, again, in these weight-cutting individuals where there's extreme starvation for a short period of time. All these have shown the same thing, that you maintain muscle or muscle health while you kind of emphasize or preferentially push towards more fat loss.
And that's in what age groups are we talking about with these studies?
Some of these athletes, for these groups we're referring to, that the one we did with looking at, I have to think for a second here, on the judo athletes, they were more of a competitive college age, maybe a little skewed older, so 24 to maybe 30, if I remember correctly. And then, for example, in the time-restricted feeding, that was probably individuals between 20 and 40 years of age. And then we did a study looking at middle-aged women and how H&B and exercise can impact intramuscular adipose tissue. So we have subcutaneous, which is we can palpate, grab right above your belt line, and you can feel that little bit of fat underneath that skin there. And hopefully
I'm familiar.
Me too. I'm doing it here, and I'm like, oh, yeah.
That's all
You don't worry about it. So that's subcutaneous, and that's what we typically think of when we think of body fat. But there's also visceral fat. That's the fat that's kind of around the organ, and we always think of that as kind of protective. But unfortunately, in obesity, that gets very large and can be a metabolic cost as well.
Dangerous, and very releasing cytokines, inflammatory compounds.
And then we have the third and final kind of category is that intermuscular adipose tissue. And for anybody out there that has ever looked at a raw steak, you look at that cross cut and you see that marbling. Yeah, exactly. That marbling, that's that intramuscular. That's great for a steak, not great for us. When that happens, then you definitely have issues with metabolic syndrome, insulin resistance. And what we found with H&B in this population that was middle-aged women, we were looking at how we can improve muscle quality, both function as well as this IMAT. And H&B was shown to reduce IMAT, which is incredibly important in this demographic because whether it's men or women, when we start getting in middle age, that's when that IMAT starts to creep up. And that's when you see these metabolic issues.
Okay.
And now we've done studies with H&B in everything from the exercising, resistance training individual who's a novice to the very well-trained, as long as there's a new training stimulus. In other words, you're pushing that envelope. Those individuals will increase muscle mass and improve strength, power, all those key indicators. We've done studies in rowing, cyclists, runners. Again, we've always shown that you can improve VO2 max, lactate threshold, all these positive muscle things, but there has to be a stressor.
Yeah, okay, so emphasizing that
stressor.
It's so much promise here, and I can't wait to try this. Love learning all of these things because I actually had never heard about this before you came in. So this is totally new to me. So exciting. But obviously making sure that people are still actually doing the groundwork though. Yeah. You've got to do that exercise, but you're going to get so much more of the benefits, particularly for older people.
This is where it gets really cool. So the stressor for older adults is aging. So in our studies, although we've done studies with an exercise intervention, that was kind of the early work with HMB. We left but kind of the focus from the college age resistance training, college age athlete kind of research. We moved into, all right, can we have an impact on older adults? So we did some studies that were exercise studies with HMB in older adults, and we started to see some benefits. And then we asked ourselves, well, what's real world? What's really going to happen? Because the percentage of older adults that exercise is not as high as we wish it was. So can we have, with this nutrient, the stressor is there. It doesn't have to be exercise in this older adult population. It'd be ideal if they did. But even if they don't, what we found is that HMB can turn that muscle machinery on in them or turn it back because, again, With age, we see a decrease in protein synthesis and an increase in protein breakdown. So we can reverse
if
that.
you're slowing that degradation, even just that on its own.
Exactly. So in the athlete,
amazing.
the training is the stimulus that we're trying to help minimize that protein breakdown. With age, that's naturally
Aging is a stressor.
is a stressor, just like cachexia. Some of these things that are occurring, the far extreme of age-related muscle loss, sarcopenia, is a whole other host of stress that comes into play, because it's more than just a loss in muscle. There's a lot of things going on in the true definition of sarcopenia.
All my perimenopausal, menopausal women out there, oh, I can't wait to share this with you.
Yes.
Yeah. So the last piece, again, going to go back to that enthusiasm I have for this ingredient. When we talk about exercise, there's another mechanism of HMB, and it goes back to that downhill running study I was talking about. Well, the metabolic fate. So we have to think of a nutrient. Right, so it's signaling, but what happens to HMB in the body when it's kind of served its purpose and it's being metabolized further? What's interesting is it goes to HMG-CoA. And HMG-CoA is a precursor to cellular cholesterol. Now, why does that matter? And we always think cholesterol is that bad for us. We're not talking about cholesterol levels in our blood. We're not talking about HDL, LDL cholesterol. We're talking about cellular cholesterol. Where do we see that biggest impact?
In our brain?
So there is some interesting research on that side of it, but I'm just going to keep it to the muscle side.
Yep.
So what happens when we have HMB moving to HMG-CoA, we see an increase in cellular cholesterol. That cholesterol is used for cell membrane kind of formation or integrity. And what we observe in all of our intense exercise protocols, in other words, if you start an exercise program, you've been novice for a while, what happens? You get that delayed onset muscle soreness. Why? Going back to that eccentric phase you're doing during your exercise, Trevor, you get that muscle
tearing apart.
That's because of that integrity of that cell is being disrupted. So you have a stronger cell membrane, it's more resistant to that breakdown. And what we found is that HMB is also protective of that membrane, as well as turning on that machinery inside. So it's that really neat combination of a true muscle health product or ingredient.
So what happens? So does that mean you retain your muscle or build, or you recover faster? What we
see is that typically with intense exercise, we're going to go back to that downhill running model, because that's just such a good one. You see this high level of muscle enzymes appear in our blood. Now, that doesn't seem like a big problem, but if you know where they're supposed to be, it's a huge problem. They're not supposed to be out circulating around. You have some background noise that's always happening. And a great way of looking at this from kind of another situation is heart is a muscle. And there is a heart type enzyme. It's called CK, or heart type CK.
Creatine kinase.
Creatine kinase, yes. When that appears in our blood, and we feel like we've had an issue with chest pains, the doctor thinks we have maybe suffered a heart attack, the first test they do, or one of the first tests they do, besides looking at all the performance of the heart, is they measure for CK. And if you have an elevation of heart type CK, you should not have that in your blood. We know you've had a recent cardiac event. There's a muscle type. So there's a muscle CK, that creatine kinase, again, when that shows up and elevated, you see there's clearly been muscle damage. What's interesting, with all these HMB studies we've done in exercise, we've always measured that muscle type or muscle CK. And what happens is in the placebo treatment, for example, in the downhill running, they can have as much as 200, 300% increase in that enzyme. With HMB, it's about half of that.
Wow.
And then what's really interesting in resistance training, which, remember, we're doing downhill running, it's mostly just affecting the quadriceps. A new resistance training program, it's all the muscle groups. You have a lot bigger pool dumping in to that bloodstream if you're damaging that muscle. And that's what we observed, is that it was almost a 400% increase in this enzyme in the placebo group, but practically no increase at all with HMB. So HMB is that protective effect. So it really becomes that kind of secret sauce, if you will, of why there's such an important driver around quality protein, having leucine. But I don't want to say like a cheat code, but here's an easy way of getting that magic signaling molecule, just oral supplementation.
Yeah, but it's
HMB.
also a way of overriding as we get older, the difficulty of actually getting that HMB from our leucine. As we start to lose our ability to digest and utilize leucine, we lose our ability to make HMB. And clearly HMB is so important, not just for maintaining muscle mass, but because this program's about longevity. That's a very big factor in what feeds into that.
Well said.
And so exciting for so many different groups. We talked about the healthy aging study I ran last year. That was a 3-month study, and we did introduce strength training. Now, I had one particular person, actually, he was a firefighter, close to retirement age, actually quite fit. There's a gym
True athlete.
there.
Yep.
But we actually sort of increased the intensity. Exercise was a big component.
Yep.
His creatine kinase went up. We had to pull back all of the exercise. And I was just thinking, what is all of this tissue down? I still don't understand why it went up so much, but just wonderful when people particularly are trying to do all of the right things as well. By the way, we obviously referred him to his doctor to check his heart was okay and everything. But I just see so many benefits for people that could be, they might have had a surgery, or they're bound, in bed for some time, or whatever it may be. But as I said, even with my women before, throwing it around there, and sorry to all the men, you go through sarcopenia too.
I love that you referred them as your women. That's pretty cool.
My women,
If I said that, I'd get in trouble. My wife might be calling me.
I guess I have a big group, and but a lot of women, I feel like, sometimes get ignored in that whole sarcopenia and the research around muscle. And the truth is, I work with these women that actually train hard, are trying really hard to keep that body composition. It does become more difficult with these changes in hormones and things like that.
Yeah.
I'm also thinking about professional football players, for example, get injured for a long period of time.
Yes.
And, this is what a great supplementation for maintaining muscle, etc.
Any injury. I did my shoulder. So playing netball last year. I did my shoulder for 6 weeks. I couldn't actually stop playing netball, which was really sad. To at 45 go.
That's what Joe did too.
Yeah, I was playing against girls that were less than half my age. They're bouncing around. Sadly, some girls on the team had a broken wrist, a broken ankle.
Wow.
I just think
as you do
my
with
hip,
women's netball teams,
my hip started going, and we all, we just decided, as much as we didn't want to, we're like, it's, we're in our 40s, late 40s. When our body isn't responding the way. Now, I'm not saying that this is going to get me back to netball, but little things where we
it's so important what you're talking about here, because this is what we've identified, I hate to go to this way because it sounds like a commercial kind of, but consumer groups that can benefit, right? So we know there's the performance-driven individuals. Those are really training for a bigger PR or a bigger outcome for whatever event they're doing. So they want to use it while they train so they get the most out of it. And then we have this next group, which is more of that active lifestyle. So back to what we're talking about is, let's make sure we recover from the exercise we do and the infrequency sometimes of the competitions we do. And then add another element in there is that it does help with body composition, which is very important to that active lifestyle, that more, trying to prevent that aggressive loss of as we age, going back to that original discussion we had about how we lose muscle as we age. And then there's the third group, which is the kind of healthy aging to the farther extreme. All these components, all these
right down to the sarcopenic.
Yeah, exactly.
So,
and then that takes us to the fourth category, and that goes into where we've done work with AIDS-related wasting.
Right.
HMB's been shown as part of a nutritional cocktail to help that process, a non-pharmaceutical approach. Cancer cachexia, we've done work there. Again, maintaining muscle. Sometimes it comes down to the appetite is so suppressed during some of these during some of these treatments, as well as the decrease in total nutrition coming in. So again, they get into maybe not a true starvation state, but just a dramatic impact on caloric consumption. So again, H&B can help protect there, and it's been shown. And then going back to bed rest and then sarcopenia. So the bed rest study I mentioned before, where you can lose as much as 2 kilos in 10 days, the H&B treatment in that same study I referenced lost nothing.
Wow.
So guess what happened during their 8 weeks of rehabilitation? Rather than just getting back to normal, they actually put on about 1 kilo of muscle mass. And this isn't like a big
kilo in
during
8 weeks. That's wow.
And then you look at that from
because
a
they're still taking the HMB.
Correct.
Okay,
so they did
because
10
that's
days.
a lot in 8 weeks to put on 1 kilo of muscle. Yeah, that's great.
They did 10 days of supplementation during the bed rest, and then they did 8 weeks of supplementation during the rehab.
While they're doing rehabilitation.
And the whole thought there is you can't really put people through a 10-day bed rest and say, okay, shake your hand, thanks for joining our study, and you walk out. I mean, that's unethical. But yet it happens all the time in hospitals, right? It happens all the time with our own lives. If we get hurt or injured, we think we can just kind of bounce right back. We have to do those rehabilitation side of things. But if we don't lose as much as the muscle, if we can maintain that muscle during times of inactivity, then we have a much better kind of springboard into the recovery phase.
Well, I definitely need to give this to my dad. He's 82 years old. He is sarcopenic. We've been at him. Exercise is not his thing. I have tried him on protein powder. Interestingly, he did say he felt better when he was taking it.
Add HMB to that protein powder, and now he has again, going back to our story here, we have the building supplies showing up. That's your you're increasing the consumption of protein. Those are the building supplies there. And now we're going to have the foreman on the job site be H&B and say, turn on the protein synthesis, reduce this breakdown, and now he'll utilize it.
So
better.
Is there anyone that shouldn't be taking this?
I mean, if you're sedentary or you're in your probably your 20s, there probably isn't a stressor. But if you're exercising, you should be using it.
Right.
If you're somebody over the age of 35 and you're wanting to maintain muscle and think about this part of your active lifestyle, by all means, you should be taking it. As we age, we should be taking it.
Okay. Is it 3 grams across the board, or does the dose adjust?
We like to recommend it's 38 milligrams of calcium H&B per kilogram of body weight. And that equals out to the average person about 3 grams per day. Now, if you're a smaller person, you could probably get by with 2 grams. We have data as low as 1.5 grams. There's a dose response curve. So even if you're taking a gram a day, you're still having a benefit. But we really think, again, for that true efficacy, we don't want somebody taking something and not seeing the benefit. So we really lean towards that 1.5 gram as the absolute minimum per day. But 3 grams is what the depth and breadth of the data tells us you need about each day.
2 quick questions.
Sure.
Heart CK.
Yes.
So when heart CK shows up in the blood in a test, the heart's been under stress. Is this of any benefit to that?
Great question. We've never done the research.
Right, okay.
One thing that's interesting is it's not a side effect, but one thing we have found consistently in the safety studies we've done is that we actually see improvements in cardiovascular risk factors.
Yes.
We see a decrease in blood levels
Yes.
of cholesterol. We see a decrease in blood pressure with HMB.
Yes.
We don't exactly know why that's all happening.
None of it's in isolation, is it?
Yeah,
It's all cascade.
exactly. Everything. We like to think of health in silos, but in reality, it's all interrelated.
Okay, number 2 is where's it derived from? Where do you get it from? What source do you get calcium?
So HMB is naturally found in kind of that metabolic fate of leucine, but we see it.
But what is that? What is that
Amino
in?
acid.
It's amino
It's an amino
acid.
acid.
So all your proteins.
So we're bringing it out of meat, or where are we?
So
where are
when
we bringing the
like if we were to measure various foodstuffs, and we've done this, we've seen everything from grapefruit to various fishes, protein sources. But what we do is we actually synthesize it to make it, more just like with our leucine.
So it's extracted, synthesized.
So we do a chemical synthesis to create it.
Okay.
Because we could do an extraction, but that'd be an incredible process, and we're hoping there could be other methods in the future. But for 30 years we've been doing this, and it's very safe. All the safety and toxicity studies are based off of that synthetic material.
I think we're all sold. I think we're all sold, and I think my parents are sold, and I think everyone that I know.
Wish I started before netball finished.
One piece I want to bring up really quick is on the sarcopenia because of your father. You brought this up. So this is incredibly important because sarcopenia is an actual diagnosis. And we're doing a study here
He
in
doesn't
Australia.
need to go to a clinic for me to diagnose that he has sarcopenia.
Doing a study in Australia.
Yeah, we are. And we're very excited about this. We can't tell you too many details about it, but we're looking at an actual sarcopenic population and the interventions H&B and vitamin D.
Right.
And the reason why that combination is because we learn so much more about vitamin D and the importance of vitamin D as outside of just bone health. For cellular function, it's important. And what we know is when you have vitamin D sufficient, you get all these benefits, not just of the muscle mass, but you get these benefits of muscle function as well. And I just want to say on the sarcopenia study that was done, this was just H&B. So, the H&B vitamin D component is just something else to kind of add in there. But the sarcopenia study that was recently published, I think it was 2 years ago, was looking at just HMB and an exercising sarcopenic population. So there was a placebo and an HMB group. What was interesting is, and unfortunate, even with exercise, hand grip strength continued to decrease with sarcopenia because there's so many things going on in the sarcopenic patient. But with HMB supplementation, you saw an increase in hand grip strength.
Wow.
Just with HMB.
With HMB. Right? And then what's really interesting is that there's a inflammatory biomarker that basically gives you an indication of how much inflammation is going on in the body. And with HMB or with the placebo, we really saw no change. And that's one of the
What was the marker there?
It's called TWEAK or T-weak. It's a really interesting inflammatory biomarker.
Okay.
And it's TWEAK. So if you look it up, it's one of those perfect example of an acronym for something that stands for something much more complex.
Not twerk, it's tweak.
Yeah, it took us a while. But the reason why I bring this one up is one of the hallmarks of true sarcopenia is inflammation. And when we can curtail inflammation, that means we're really getting behind the root of the the problem.
Comes up in every podcast.
Yep. So here's what's
Inflammation
really interesting
for your
is with
inflammation.
H&B supplementation, not only do we improve that strength or that muscle function, inflammation decreased too over a 12-week time period. So we're really kind of taking them out of maybe that sarcopenic, definition.
Yeah.
That's
yeah.
amazing.
So anyway,
So look,
good
the studies seem to be going on and on. We'll learn more and more about
We're
this.
always
it's
researching it, yes.
Super
Yeah.
excited to hear how this
Three
this
more
research goes
questions,
on.
eh? Denise, you've got one,
Yeah,
you've got
yeah.
one
So
for
I just
us?
want to say thank you so much. Like, it's not often I hear something that's totally brand new. And I said that was totally brand new. I've never heard of
Fantastic.
that. So
Thank you.
really excited. Love to learn things for myself, for the people I work with. So what do you take? What's in your regime
Your little
for
protocol.
Very interesting.
your healthy aging protocol?
Yeah. So, as I've gotten into my 50s, first of all, what really triggered me, so I've always used supplements. I've always been around nutrition. As an athlete, I tried to be mindful. I've been around this industry for a long time. So, I used to do all the different, muscle builders, like, your creatines, all these things that help. But unfortunately, in my 40s, I had a full rupture of my Achilles. And I was like, okay, here's what I'm going to really focus on. I shouldn't just be a theoretical physiologist. I should actually be an applied physiologist, biochemist. And I thought, what should I be taking? So I focused on, obviously, protein, H&B, vitamin D. And I'll tell you what, that healing and that recovery from that ruptured Achilles was phenomenal.
Wow.
But in your mind, you're thinking, why am I only doing this because I just got injured?
Yes.
Why am I not doing this and being more cognizant of this? So I really started taking this more healthy approach to that right protein supplementation daily. If I see myself not consuming the right amount of protein in my diet naturally, I supplement. I add it in. I find places where I can bring in more protein.
Yep.
I add vitamin D every day.
How much vitamin D out of interest?
So I personally am one of those individuals that takes a lot to move my 25-hydroxy-vitamin D levels. So I take between 5,000 and 10,000.
Okay.
Reason why?
Per day?
IU per day.
So that's in Australia. That's a lot too. Our upper limit's generally 5,000 IU.
Exactly.
Have you had your genes tested? Is it
So
genetic?
actually, we work. Yes, it is. So
Okay.
I work with a analytical lab, and we do our bloods, and we can measure vitamin D. We have the full. Actually, the lab is one of the gold standard labs in the U.S. for vitamin D analysis. So I have that luxury literally down the hall from where I'm at. So I measure my own vitamin D, and I can see I'm an autoresponder. The reason why there's such a large fluctuation in there. Summertime versus wintertime.
Oh,
Yeah.
And in Iowa.
Yep.
Yeah.
In Iowa, we're right there in the Midwest, and it gets pretty dark and gloomy here.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was deficient all the time when I lived in Melbourne here, but now that I live on the sunny coast, I don't supplement and I'm fine. But genetically,
Yeah,
I'm
yeah.
not too bad. But genetically, some of us need a lot more vitamin D. Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's just those
Anything else?
things. Is there anything else?
So I do like take a multi, and I also kind of self-create my own multivitamin mineral just based off of all those things. So I take everything from zinc, vitamin C. Those are things I really kind of focus on. I also use we don't want to get into too much of this, but I use an ingredient called 2-HOBA. It's 2-hydroxybenzylamine. It's a free radical scavenger, very specific to isoloboglandins, which are the highly reactive, highly inflammatory. It's probably one of the roots of chronic inflammatory disease. So I take that one daily, in addition to everything else I've mentioned daily.
When
Wow,
I edit
that
the
might be another
podcast, I will
podcast.
be taking note of
I was
that.
going to say that's another podcast.
So
Yeah.
2-HOBA, or HOBA means the brand name. Very
Trev,
great.
what have you got?
Question we ask everybody.
Okay.
If you, via your own wisdom, what you're discovering, what we're all discovering, if you get yourself another 10 years of health, longevity, life force, 10 years of great life,
Yes.
why would you want it? What would you do with it? What
That
for
is
you
a
personally?
Great question, you guys. Wow. I go right back to, I have a son that's 22 and a daughter that's 19, and I guess it'd be see how everything shakes out for them and be part of that, right?
Yes,
So
yeah.
that'd be like ideal for me. And then, I don't know. That's just like one of those that's like very deep
It's
questions.
a powerful
Yes.
question.
Oh,
I'm
wow.
an older mum, and he asked
Yeah.
me, and I knew that it was coming because he mentioned it before the first podcast. First podcast.
Oh no, I feel it like right now I'm just like getting like
cried.
sentimental.
You can,
yeah,
you
yeah.
can. I did,
Yeah.
yeah.
No. I don't think I'm all the way there, but I can feel it. Like
Yeah.
it's a very good question because we started off this way talking about longevity. The question is, who wants to live forever? You have to have a reason.
The why.
But
What's
that's the
deeper
quality
why?
of life and the deeper why. That's right. And I think it's the joy of discovery and
Yeah.
being a part of those things with your family and your friends. And kind of seize that moment. Living in the now, I think, is so important. So many people worry about what's happened, can't control that. They worry about things that are going to be in the future, can't control that, right? Live in the now. And I think having that opportunity to live in the now a little bit longer when you have that wisdom would be pretty cool.
That's an awesome answer.
That's really beautiful.
I can't remember my question. What's your favorite color? I think we can wind it up.
No, the last thing is anywhere we can check out what you're doing.
How can we find you?
Find you.
How
and
can
people
we
should
share?
know
Yeah,
more
exactly.
about.
People that are like, oh my God, I need to know more about these
what
products,
you're
this
doing.
person,
What's
the
funny
company.
is I kind of keep I have social media stuff. I don't use it.
But you know what? With regards to HMB,
So you just see HMB is I do. So our company is TSI Group.
Yep.
We have the ingredient HMB along with other ingredients.
but they can also find that information at Melrose Health
Exactly.
as well.
I was just going to say, I think for really to find more about HMB, go to Melrose Health, check that out. You can look at our website, myhmb.com, and then you see a lot of the research that I didn't just do. A lot of the stuff I'm saying is I and me is actually a team. Brilliant people, much smaller than me, much smarter than me.
Really?
Oh yeah, these
That's a
guys are
super smart
great.
team.
This has all happened from a lot of people over a long period of time, isn't it?
Yes,
'Cause we've
yeah.
honed in. I just
always
love
a
this
Sadly,
moment
one of
in
our
time.
founders of our company, who was one of the original discoverers, there were two discoverers, Najee Abumrad and Stephen Nissen. He passed away. He had a stroke about, oh my gosh, it's been 17 years ago, and passed away just last year. But looking back on the people that have been around this team, incredibly smart people to ask the question why.
Yeah.
Like he saw leucine had this effect. So both Najee and Steve both asked the question, well, why? And they started looking at these metabolites. Well, why is this happening? Why? They were the ones that kept asking that. And people like John Rothmacher and John Fuller, brilliant researchers that are around this research. If it wasn't for all the different collaborators, all that stuff, none of this stuff would be known.
From there,
Exciting time.
from that inquiry to that research to now creating something that is available to the masses that can make a real difference to people's lives. Amazing.
Yeah, I'm really
work.
excited about this product, this Melrose Health product, because it has collagen, which is a protein, has vitamin D, and it has HMB.
Fantastic.
It's just a really exciting product.
Shawn
watch
Baier,
me.
I would love to keep on talking. I am conscious of time.
I can hang out with you guys all day. I'm supposed to fly home tomorrow. Can I stay a little longer?
You can stay as long as you want. Thank you so much.
Thanks,
that
Shawn.
was
Truly my
just
pleasure.
fantastic.
You guys are the best. You come here every day. This is fantastic.
Anytime.
Teach me how to surf, okay?
Yeah, absolutely. That's no
How big a
worries
board
at
do you
all.
have?
That's I've got many boards. Don't worry, every
Sure he
size.
does. Once again, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Thanks,
you.
Shawn.
Appreciate you guys.
Bye, everyone.